hitting record. So welcome anybody watching the recording, and we're about to hear from Caroline Nettekoven.
Perfect. One sec, I'll just remove that. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that introduction.
Right.
Someone might be unmuted.
I think I took care of it.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to share my work. I've very much enjoyed listening to the past speakers this year and last year. So I think this is a very exciting initiative, and I'm looking forward to discussing my work with everyone. So yeah, I'm currently doing research in Canada on language processing in the cerebellum. But before that, I worked at the University of Cambridge on using natural language processing tools in combination with graph theory for a new perspective on abnormal language in schizophrenia. In the work that I'll present to you today, I combined natural language processing and network analysis into an algorithm that can capture formal thought disorder in psychosis. And we've packaged our algorithm as a toolbox and released it with the paper, which came out on Wednesday. So congratulations to everyone. I'll present our framework to you and the features of speech that we can get from this framework that differentiate patient from control speech. And then in the second half, we'll give a brief demonstration on just how you can use the tool for your own purposes. And for that, I'll be joined by Ryan, who's helping maintain our toolbox. So as you all know, one of the big challenges in psychiatry is mapping the complexity and the heterogeneity of schizophrenia. So although schizophrenia is recognized for its diverse phenotype, really objectively describing and measuring this is difficult. And so new approaches for automated analysis of psychotic symptoms could help not only diagnosis and also disease monitoring disease trajectory, but I think it could also help understand our understanding of schizophrenia phenotypes. So there's a clear clinical and scientific need in my mind for developing such tools. Now, a core feature of psychotic disorders is formal thought disorder, and I'm sure this audience is very familiar, but I'll just briefly review this. So formal thought disorder is manifested in disorganized or incoherent speech, and there are different dimensions of formal thought disorder and its manifestations in speech. And one idea that we were particularly, one dimension we were particularly intrigued by is this loosening of associations, where the connections between ideas appears to be tenuous and extraneous ideas intrude into the train of thought. Now, recently, several automated approaches have been proposed to capture and quantify disorganized speech in speech transcripts from patients with psychotic disorders. For example, Natalia Motta and colleagues, Natalia Motta, I think I've seen in the audience, so that's very exciting, proposed a graph theoretical approach where speech is represented as a graph. And in those graphs, which you can see over here, each node is a word, and then consecutive words appearing in the sentence are connected by an edge. And Motta and colleagues then went on to show that connectivity of those speech graphs was significantly reduced in patients with schizophrenia compared to healthy control subjects. But we thought these word trajectory graphs are a really interesting framework to capture speech features, but they ignore semantic content. And we know that semantic coherence is often altered in psychosis. So there's other automated approaches that have been proposed to look at semantic content specifically of the speech. For example, an automated measure of speech coherence based on latent semantic analysis has been proposed. So briefly, in latent semantic analysis, you represent each word as a vector. Words in similar contexts are then represented by similar vectors. And semantic coherence can then be measured by calculating the average similarity between the words used in the transcript. Now, it's been shown that quantifying coherence using a slightly modified version of this LSA approach shows differences between first episode psychosis patients and controls as well as between first episode psychosis patients and clinical high-risk participants. I hope you can see my cursor here. Yeah, so that's been shown in a clinical sample. And since both speech graphs, these network approaches to speech, and also semantic analysis show promise in capturing features of incoherent speech in psychosis, we thought that combining these two could be powerful. So we therefore set out to create semantic speech networks, so speech networks that capture the semantic content of the speech. Working generally with speech transcripts of people that are describing pictures like the one you see over here. For example, if the person described the picture here, they might say, I see a man on the picture and he is wearing a jacket. And our idea of a semantic speech network for the spoken text would then have as nodes the entities I, man, jacket, and picture. And the relations between those nodes would be the relations, the edges would be the relations that the speaker expressed in the text. So I see a man, see would here be the relation between I and a man. So we've been developing a tool that can generate semantic speech networks from transcribed speech in an automated fashion. As a quick side note, actually, the aim of this project was really to provide a tool for automated analysis of speech in psychosis, but we think that this framework could be more broadly applicable. And this slightly touches on to Friederike Stein's discussion on transdiagnostic aspects of form of thought disorder that we heard about in the last seminar. So we'd be really excited to also think about ways in which other mental health disorders map onto this. Our tool builds on natural language processing libraries to generate these semantic speech networks. So specifically here, I combine Stanford NLP and OpenIE5, which are two state-of-the-art and widely used NLP libraries for annotating text and extracting information from it. But I think we've all seen, especially over the last weeks, there's a lot of movement in the NLP community. And therefore, what we've aimed to do is really to make this tool quite modular, so that as NLP as a field advances, we could plug in language models that might be even better fitted to capture relations expressed in the text. Initially, Nets does some pre-processing on the text. So that includes just cleaning the text of any irrelevant information, ums and ahs, for example. Also just splitting it into sentences, tokenization, and then tagging the parts of speech so that we know which grammatical category each word belongs to. Then we also do something called co-referencing, where essentially the NLP tool can capture the fact that if you say, I see a man and he is wearing a jacket, the fact that he is referring back to the man. So that's referred to as co-referencing, and the structure is captured in the first step. Then what we do with Nets is we find the nodes and edges. So we extract the entities from the transcripts, which are usually nouns, pronouns, and adjectives, which then become the nodes of our semantic speech network. And we then extract the relations between the entities, which become the edges of the network. And that relies mostly on OpenIE5, this information extraction algorithm. Finally, those words that refer to the same entity, as I just mentioned with he and man, they are merged so that they become one node, so that we have each entity only represented once in the network. Nets then constructs a network X object and plots a visualization of it for you to check, and saves the output so that you can later analyze it. So after processing a single speech transcript with this tool, we arrive at a graph like this. So here you can see a semantic speech network that resulted from a person describing what they see in this picture in the bottom right. And you can see the speech transcript that was fed into the tool here at the top in its raw form. And these resulting networks are directed. They can have parallel edges and they can have self loops. So meaning if I say I see a man, then the node is directed going from I to man. Self loops refer to the fact that you can have a direct edge between the same node, and parallel loops, parallel edges, just means that you can have several edges going between the same node in the same direction. So I'll just show you a few example semantic speech networks from transcript speech of volunteers describing these pictures, just for you to get an idea of what is the information that we capture with this approach. So a common motif in these networks is this star shape. And often what you have in the most central node is, for example, I, and that is because most people, when they describe a picture, they refer back to themselves. So they say, I see a bunch of men, I can see, I think about the picture, I like the picture. So that is why I often appears in the middle of this network. We also often find the main subject of the transcript at the center of the network. In this case, the subject of the picture is some men, and we can see that appears in the middle of the network with different edges going away, describing this particular entity. It is also often at the center, which then refers to the image shown. So the picture is dark, the picture looks scary, something like this. This is an example of quite a rich graph, and that is due to the fact that the person, even though it was relatively similar in length, so we matched the length of the picture descriptions to be at about 1 minute. The length is quite similar to the previous ones, but the person uses a lot of adjectives, which also become nodes, and really describes the image quite richly. So we end up at a well-connected graph like this. So now, after developing our semantic speech network tool, what we wanted to do is first just characterize the properties of these speech networks that we get. So for this, we used a large data set of speech transcripts that were collected from the general public by our collaborators at King's College. So they collected these speech transcripts in an online study. And again, participants were asked to describe one of these 8 pictures. These pictures are stimuli from the thematic apperception test, short TAT. And each picture was then described for 1 minute of audio recording, and these audio recordings were then transcribed manually. Here you can just see an overview plot of all the semantic speech networks in the online study dataset. So you can see that we have 400 participants in this dataset. They described 8 pictures, so we obtain about 3,000 semantic speech networks. So it's a pretty large data set and good data set to really get an idea of what is the structure of these networks in general. What are we capturing? So to get a feel for the characteristics, we looked at some basic properties of the semantic speech networks. So here, what I'm showing you is just the distribution of the number of nodes in the network. So that's the number of entities, if you remember back in the semantic speech networks. And here is the relationship between the number of nodes and the number of edges, which is, as you can see, nicely linear. We were particularly interested in the number of weakly connected components in the networks. So that is how many connected components does a single network consist of, and how large do these connected components get on average. And that is because when we visualized the networks, we noticed that there are these little islands of connected components floating around in the network. And we thought that might capture something that is interesting in terms of the nature of the speech. You can see here the number of connected components in the speech networks as the blue bars in the histogram. And in gray, I hope you can see this, in gray, we've plotted the number of connected components in size-matched random networks. So these networks were generated from random networks that were matched in the number of nodes and number of edges to the original speech networks to have some kind of a baseline or benchmark for comparison. And what you can see is that the speech network distribution is slightly shifted compared to the random network, so slightly shifted to the left. Now you can see this a bit clearer histograms below. So here what I'm showing you is the number of connected components in the semantic speech networks normalized to the number in random networks. So the 0 here is where that random network distribution would live. So the speech networks here, you can really see that shift compared to random networks. So speech networks generally have fewer connected components than these random networks. In the size measures, you can also see that speech networks generally include larger connected components than random networks. So this gets very clear in the median size of the connected components. The median size, since it is less affected by the largest component, is a bit more representative of the component sizes in the networks. Now, the distribution of the median size of connected components in speech graphs is shifted to the right compared to random networks. So speech networks have fewer and larger connected components than random networks. And we think that this reflects the kind of non-random nature of the networks, since people are connecting entities in a non-random fashion. After exploring these semantic speech networks of the general public, we then went on to test whether there are any differences in the networks of psychosis patients, high-risk populations, and healthy controls. So to do this, we looked at the OASIS dataset that includes patients, high-risk participants, and healthy controls, also collected by our colleagues at King's College in London. And this dataset includes speech transcripts from 52 participants, where the participants either experienced first episode psychosis or were at clinical high risk for developing psychosis, or were healthy controls. And these participants performed the exact same task of describing one of 8 pictures, again, for about 1 minute. So we constructed semantic speech networks from the OASIS dataset, which you can see here color-coded by group identity. And here and in the following slides, you will always see the groups colored this way. So healthy controls are always going to be shown in blue. The clinical high-risk group is going to be shown in orange. And then the first episode psychosis patients are going to be shown in green. And after constructing these graphs for the 3 groups, we tested whether the groups differ in the graph measures that we've calculated. So first of all, we find that the 3 groups differ in the size of their networks. So the number of nodes and the number of edges differ significantly between first episode psychosis patients and control networks. Now, we also see these differences actually in more basic measures that would just derive solely from the speech transcripts. So the number of sentences and the number of words in the transcript show a difference between first episode psychosis and control transcripts. So that means our networks replicate differences in the amount of speech that can be found in more basic measures of the speech transcript, just simply counting the number of words and sentences. But of course, we're hoping to find signal that tells us something about characteristics of patient speech that goes over and above these basic measures, just reflecting the amount of speech. So we decided to look at our graph measures normalized by measures calculated on random networks. And these random networks, again, were matched for the number of nodes and edges in the real networks to control for the size difference. So what does that mean specifically? We created 1,000 random networks for each one of our real networks. And those 1,000 random networks are matched for the number of nodes and number of edges in the real network. We then calculated the graph measures in both our real network and our 1,000 random networks that match this real network. And then we normalized the value that we get for the real network by the value of its 1,000 size matched random networks. And then specifically, we looked here at the number of weakly connecting components and the average size of those components, since they seem to reflect something about the speech in these semantic speech networks. When we look at these normalized values, we see an interesting pattern. So on the left here, you can see the number of the normalized number of weakly connected components. And you can see that there are more connected components in the graphs of first episode psychosis patients than in the graphs of high risk and control patients, with a significant difference between patients and controls here. On the right, you can now see the mean size and the median size of connected components. And here you can see that psychosis patients on average have smaller connected components than high risk and participants and controls, where the significant difference appears between high risk and patient networks. And in the median size of connected components, you can see that the patient networks are significantly smaller than both the healthy control networks and the high-risk networks. Now, what does this actually look like? This means that the semantic speech networks of patients have more and smaller connected components than the networks of healthy controls. And the networks of high-risk participants are kind of in between patients and healthy control participants. Earlier, I showed you the difference between the speech networks from the general public to random networks, where we saw that speech networks were characterized by these larger and fewer connected components than random networks that were not generated from speech transcripts. And it appears that the networks from patients are actually closer to something like random networks in their number and size of connected components. So their connectedness appears more random-like. And this kind of fragmentation of these semantic speech networks of psychosis patients and clinical high-risk participants potentially, we think that this could reflect the loosening of associations in psychosis, although we're cautious and not over-interpreting these results. But these patient control differences in semantic speech networks could certainly be preliminary evidence for these networks being potentially useful in schizophrenia research and for clinical applications. Now, these group differences already controlled for any differences in the network sizes that reflect the amount of speech by normalizing to these random networks. But we also wanted to make extra sure that we see group differences survive controlling for the amount of speech directly by including the number of words in the statistical model. So we used a linear regression where we controlled for the number of words in the transcript directly in the model. And we found that the difference between patients and controls in the number and the median size of the connected components remained significant after controlling for the number of words, but the other differences didn't survive controlling for the number of words in the transcript. Finally, we also wanted to see how the measures derived from the semantic speech network cluster with other NLP measures. So I already introduced some NLP measures that are more established in the introduction of the talk. And we selected these NLP measures that have been used to show differences between psychosis patients and controls from the literature. So we calculated these measures for our clinical data set. And to understand how our novel measures then compare to these established measures, we use a clustering method to group the measures according to their correlation coefficients in the clinical data set. And specifically, we then use the Louvain method to see whether how these communities, these clustering communities look. So you can see here the correlation map with the resulting communities marked in these black outlines. And we can see, first of all, that the number of nodes and the number of edges in the semantic speech network are highly correlated with the number of words in the transcript. So measures of the amount of speech naturally cluster with measures of the size of the semantic speech network. But we also see that the normalized measures of the number and size of the connected components form their own community. And we think that this might suggest that our connected component measures capture signal that could be different or complementary to other NLP measures. Then lastly, we also tested if the semantic speech networks correlate with any symptom scores. So for this, we used the thought and language index and the positive and negative syndrome scale. To test this, we calculated a linear regression of symptom measures controlling for, again, number of words, and this time also group membership, and looked at which relationships are significant. We did find that median size of connected components seems to have a relationship with the TLI negative scores. So participants whose networks had more and smaller connected components also scored higher on the negative, higher on the negative TLI dimension. And we also found that the connected component number and average size was correlated with PANS negative scales. So those participants whose networks had more and smaller connected components scored higher on the negative PANS dimension. But I should mention, none of these relationships actually survived Bonferroni correction for multiple comparisons. So we're cautious in not over-interpreting this. This could suggest a trend, but really we have to test this in larger sample sizes. Then we also just explored the relationship between the semantic speech network measures and the thought and language index subscales. And here we saw that apart from a relationship with poverty of speech, the median connected component size showed the strongest association with the looseness TLI subscale. But again, these associations did not reach significance. None of them also survived correcting for multiple comparisons. So just to summarize what I showed you, we developed a toolbox that creates semantic speech networks from speech transcripts. And we really think that these semantic speech networks allow a rich mapping of the content of speech as a network. We examined some very simple measures of network size and connectivity, and those already showed these significant and robust group differences between first episode psychosis patients, clinical high-risk subjects, and healthy controls. The measures might relate to symptom severity, although this needs to be tested in larger samples. And these measures, we think, provide complementary information to establish NLP measures. But what we're really excited about is really a new perspective onto speech in psychosis, a new way of mapping semantic content as a network. The tool is freely available as a Python package called Networks of Transcribed Semantics, short NETS. And we wanted to make sure to provide this tool to the community because we think that with this low computational cost and this rich information, we can provide a useful framework for exploring the semantic content of speech using this toolbox. We've also created detailed documentation and tutorials on the tool because we know that sometimes what really hinders the community of actually using any of these novel tools is getting it to work on your own data. So we wanted to make it as useful and user-friendly as possible so that it's easier to use for researchers and clinicians, especially those who haven't interacted with Python or command line in general, where it's a little tricky. So later, Ryan will actually take over and demonstrate the setup and running of nets in the first tutorial. And I will then end by showing how we can analyze the generated networks in the second tutorial. Now, if you would like to follow along, you can scan these QR codes, which will take you to the tutorials. And there's also a link to the tutorials as an interactive notebook, so interactive Python notebook, where you can run it on your own laptop easily. But first, I'd like to acknowledge our funders and collaborators for their support. Firstly, thank you to my PI, Sarah Morgan, for her invaluable support. I want to thank the Alan Turing Institute for funding this project and our colleagues at King's College London for collecting the data. Of course, I want to thank all the participants who took part in this study and the team from the Alan Turing and the Cambridge Machine Learning Clinic for helping making this tool user-friendly and getting it out there. Thank you to everyone who is listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions before we move on to the tool demonstration.
So people are invited to raise their hand. Thank you, Lena. Or if you want me to read out your question, just enter it into the chat. Lena, go ahead.
Thank you, Sunny. Thank you very much, Caroline. This was an excellent talk, and I've read the paper previously and really was looking forward for this talk, and it was great. I had a very brief clarification question. There was at one point in your general population sample, around 415 people from which you derived the initial speech metrics. Around 16 or 20, I don't remember the number correctly, but some of them did not have any graphs generated because they didn't speak about entities. What were they speaking about? Why did they not have those graphs at all developed?
Yeah, so this is where we, so what can happen in the transcripts is actually that this is something I'll go into later when I'm going to show how the tool works. What can happen is that you can have a graph that is empty, which we then excluded from the analysis. And the reason that this graph is empty is simply because nets didn't find a relation that you express between two entities. Now, if we think of someone who just essentially speaks in half sentences. So this is the tricky thing about speech, real speech. The fact that people restart sentences over and over again, what can happen is that you actually don't express any relation between things, or not in a way that our tool at the moment is able to capture it. So what I can think of is if someone just goes and says, I think, maybe, I don't know, the man, but also like if you, it sounds a bit odd, but people do this in real speech. And that's what I found in some of the transcripts that didn't result in any networks. There just wasn't a relation expressed. Now, on the other hand, I also have to caution that nets isn't perfect, and these language models develop over time, especially in the last few weeks. We've seen a lot of movement there. And so it is also possible that nets simply wasn't able to find something that me as a reader of the transcript, I would have seen this in the transcript possibly. I haven't seen this much, so this is really the exception at the moment, that I see a relation in the transcript and it doesn't appear in the network, but it isn't perfect, and that can happen. So these two factors, I think, play into why you can have a transcript and then no actual edges that you can plot in the network.
Inspired by your work, we have applied this network, nets, to some of our speech data. And in fact, we wanted to see relationship with functioning as an external validator rather than TLI score itself within the speech sample. And I'm very happy to say we are finding very similar median connected component reduced in schizophrenia. And we're also finding it relating to both processing speed as well as global functioning of these patients. So, that data is not published yet. It's not out in preprint, but thanks for what you've done. This is really inspiring.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I'd be excited to talk about that more offline. That's really cool. Yeah, so yeah, I might send you an email about that.
Yeah, just wanted to mention, occasionally I've seen people read off, almost sound like they're reading off lists in picture descriptions as well. So like man, house, bridge. So I imagine that might be a similar circumstance.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to add to that point, actually. I'm going to show this later, but the nets networks actually capture this too. It's just not something that we've analyzed, and it's not something that we're plotting. So because we want to plot literally just the connections in the speech, you can have an empty graph, meaning you don't see anything, but we still store the fact that you have mentioned entities, just they're stored as unconnected nodes, and I'll show that later. So you would be able to actually incorporate that into the analysis. And we've looked at very basic measures here, and connected components wouldn't really capture this, since connected components are always about the walks that you can take. But those single unconnected nodes are part of the stored network, so you would be able to incorporate that.
Okay, that's good to know. So I think our next hand is from Galina.
Yeah, I wanted to ask on a similar topic, because I kind of thought you showed an example where there was a reference he, and there were several candidates, to my opinion, that could be related to this he. And from my knowledge, people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia in their speech are often using referential devices in either incorrect or maybe less conventional ways. So I think that it might be more difficult for existent NLP tools to correctly resolve coreferences. And this might artificially enhance the disconnectedness of the graph, And I saw that you also had a metric of the number of ambiguous references. Mm-hmm. So I think that might be worth investigating a little more, because this can strongly influence the connectedness of the graph. If the he is not mapped onto the correct node that it relates to, it will disconnect two components.
Yeah, that's right. So I completely agree with you there. The co-referencing that we're using at the moment really relies on the language model being able to resolve that co-referencing. Now, I think two things can happen. One is the tool can fail to find an actual co-reference that you and I would be able to spot from the transcript. But also sometimes I find it ambiguous, especially when there's several subjects in the picture that people could be referring to, that I find it ambiguous as to who they're referring to when the NLP tool also can't capture this. So I think it's useful, the fact that we're relying on something that is trained on a large corpus of text, because if the NLP tool can't find it, oftentimes whenever I see something odd like that in the network, I see two nodes where I think there should be only one for something. I usually go back into the transcript and see whether I can find that ambiguity also in the transcript or something went wrong. And usually what happens is I also see why those weren't merged. It's not quite obvious to me as the viewer. So I think incorporating that as an aspect of how many nodes are actually similar in what you're referring to but can't be merged would be an interesting thing to look at the co-referencing these abnormalities that you spoke about.
Yeah, I just meant that the models, all of them, are usually trained on very typical and also written speech. Yeah. And when they are applied to spoken, and especially atypical spoken language, they might perform much worse than they would on written speech and typical written speech. And another thing I wanted to mention, that there is a tool called abstract meaning representation, which does similar work. So they also represent text with semantic graphs of the text. So I don't know if you've heard of it, and if you haven't, maybe you can look into it and maybe incorporate some of what they do.
Is this, so who is the author on that tool? Do you recall? I might not be familiar with the name of the tool.
Yeah, I will just send a link.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, absolutely. And the point that you mentioned with speech being very different from written text, that is an important aspect that we also looked into when actually deciding for the language model that we wanted to use. So there are very few comparisons here, and I found none that actually looked at how spoken text, so just transcribed text, these language models perform on those. I did find an analysis of how different language models perform on social media text, which is slightly different from like news articles, but not entirely speech. And there, I think, so the model that we chose was the winner out of them in terms of how it performed. But there's absolutely room to grow.
Great. Yes, that's really exciting and some kind of technical advances. Galina, you mentioned abstract meaning representation, AMRs. So our group is actually currently looking into this this type of modeling as well. So Peter Little.
Yes, good. Thanks for a very exciting talk. Well, two questions. One I hope is very brief, and that is, did you examine the difference in the predictions from the different pictures? You know, those pictures differ in either the richness, like the guy under the street lamp is a much less rich picture, or indeed in emotional content or social content or various other things. Did you examine differences between the different pictures?
Yes, so I think we looked at all the way in the beginning. We didn't see any differences between the pictures. We definitely looked at it in the general public. I think we also looked at it in the clinical data, but I will have to check. From what I recall, we didn't see any differences. However, what we did look at, we looked at another task that the clinical group performed, which was retelling of stories. We didn't find the same differences as we did in the picture description task. And we think that this might actually could speak to a problem maybe with nets. but it might also speak to the fact that there's, as you mentioned, these differences between different types of stimuli and evoked speech through that. So I think that the picture description task is also what we ended up using for follow-up studies, since other NLP measures also showed more reliable differences there.
Right. Okay, thanks. If I could just slip in another question, this one might even be trickier because it's more conceptual. You said that you were well, chasing after looseness of associations, and indeed, well, there's a good reason for that. But I guess I've been interested for quite some years in what we call, well, what's usually called poverty of content of speech, namely relatively small amount of poverty, of informative content relative to the number of words. And it's well, first of all, when I designed the TLI, I had weakening of goal in there as my attempt to capture that. I think that item fails in the TLI. In fact, I can now criticize the TLI for lots of reasons, but I won't now. The bottom line is I noticed that your measure for number of no's didn't correlate with weakening of goal, but I would start by blaming the TLI, not your measure. But I still am interested in the question of whether you would still argue that the measure you've pulled out as most informative is a measure of looseness, or is it nearer to poverty of content?
Yeah, I think that you raise a good point there. I would say that we call it fragmentation at the moment because the network is fragmented, and then the association to looseness is very, very immediate there. I'm a little more cautious making a strong argument for what it actually reflects, because I think our sample is simply too small to really see what that biggest association is with. So that is why I kind of tried to de-emphasize the correlation, even though we were really interested in what does it actually mean.
Sure.
Yeah, so
okay, good. Yeah, well, I'll leave it there because I said it was a conceptual question that doesn't have an easy answer, but thanks very much.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on Peter's question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, first, hello to Peter. We go back many, many years.
Yes.
I have a question about the issue of looseness of association. First of all, I really want to commend you for this very, very exact and very careful, descriptive approach. The question I have, could you use this approach to better understand the underlying mechanism of the looseness of associations? In particular, as you probably know, one of the issues there is that patients are unable to use the context of the sentence. They are very I would say, undisciplined about the context. They disregard the context and put in the connection which fits their particular mood or their particular idea at the time. So my question is really, could your approach be used to better understand the underlying mechanism for these loose associations?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, so this is something that I've been thinking about a little bit, because we had to stop short a little bit of going down a rabbit hole and analyzing everything that I could think about. But your question kind of allows me to do that. What I think would be really interesting is, because right now we're just looking at connected components, right? We haven't actually looked at the labels of the nodes that maybe make up the connected components. So something that I think would map onto your idea would be an analysis of what is that most central node, and is the most central, is the node that actually describes the subject of the picture. So for example, several men, is that actually being connected with many other things? Or do people essentially just mention this entity once and then completely talk about something else? So I think actually incorporating what those words are into the analysis could be really, really interesting to map on exactly that. So the short answer is yes, I think so. Yeah. We haven't done it yet, though.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wolfram?
Yes, hello. Thanks very much. I was also very pleased to see your paper out. As it happens in this special issue that was mentioned several times, there is another paper by Claudio Palominos, who I think is also now in the audience. which is effectively about the same phenomenon, I would say. This is graph theoretic, and the nodes are basically referential NPs, or referential expressions. And that kind of leads to my question: what do you actually mean by semantic? Because we called our graphs referential structure graphs, so that's what they were supposed to capture. And I think that is what your graphs effectively capture. They are about the referential structure of psychotic discourse. And I think that re-raises the question about mechanisms that was just posed. Why should it be the case that when we look at the meaning of psychotic discourse, that it should be the referential structure which is specifically affected? Because that's what you're looking at, that's what you're measuring. And what so many other studies have measured is very complementary to that. Namely, it's more like the conceptual structure, what you measure with semantic similarity measures and so on. So I think if we are looking for mechanisms, we need to ask the question, what is it that derails the referential aspect of meaning?
That's an excellent question. And yes, absolutely. I completely take your point that our networks are really derived based on the grammatical relations that these language models were first of all trained on, and that we also explicitly utilize, for example, when we look at, so our extraction doesn't happen only based on these language models, we also have edges that are derived solely by the fact that there's a particular grammatical structure between two sets of words. So absolutely grammar in this case plays a really important role in derived networks. Now, what I would push back on slightly is that the reason that we called it semantic speech networks is that even though this is the way that we derive the networks, what really we want to do is represent the semantics. Now, we stopped short of this in our analysis. Analysis is really just about these kind of basic connected component measures. But our idea was to actually incorporate semantics and something like word embedding into the analysis of then the structure. And I think that could be much richer in this case. Now, that is why our idea was mapping semantic relations, where we've got the entities as just sole entities, and you don't represent the entirety of what someone says, so we don't represent the pronouns and everything else, but we really want to map what someone said and the relations between those things, which I think gets much more at semantics than just examining the grammatical structure, if that makes any sense.
So my group and Amir Niksad, who was the first author, and he's in the audience today. I think we also looked at a similar approach, and we also called it semantic, actually, Wolfram. And I think we also were conceptualizing the relationships that Caroline, you were incorporating into edges. We were thinking of those as action predication relationships. So thinking about the semantic content that way.
Yes, thank you. I will definitely, I apologize, I haven't read the issue yet. I was a little caught up with preparing the talk, but yeah, this is one on my list that I'll definitely have to give a read.
Great. So should we go next to Che?
Thank you. Thank you for a beautiful presentation, Caroline. I'm not so familiar to network analysis in general, in fact, but depending on my, I think if I'm not wrong, there are in nodes, edges, and hubs, for instance. When you mention, for instance, in your example, for instance, I is like a hub, in fact, if I'm not wrong, because every edges visit this hub and go through in their way.
Yeah.
I think that, but you can not calculate this kind of thing in your toolbox, or is there a way? It
Yes.
could be important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so these networks, you could definitely derive measures of hubs rich clubs as well. Now these measures are fairly small, these networks are fairly small, but you can still use all the capabilities that you have. So Network X is a particular Python package that has all of these measures where you can calculate them. You can calculate those on the semantic speech networks as well, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, my last question. And I think your participants, especially perceptual psychosis participants, depending on your study results, is like much more negative symptoms dominated. That is why we see mainly short sentences, not complex sentences and fragmented sentences. I wonder, especially when I think the positive symptoms dominated participants, for instance, especially in some languages, such as referential phrases is gender-free. How the toolbox can deal with these situations, these problems?
So I'm not sure I understood the question completely right, but you're right in that here I think we're reaching the limitations of our clinical sample, where we were just really working with a sample where some of the measures even didn't have that much variance. So you mentioned the negative scales. I agree. We ran into our limitations there with the variance, but I think the second question, the second part, I didn't quite get with what
sorry, it's like, for instance, think about the TED picture, and people say, my mom is beautiful, she is good, but my mom and she can, for instance, in Turkish, we don't have she, it's gender free.
Okay. Yes, I think I'm, yeah, so at the moment, the NETS toolbox only exists for English, actually, that's right. We would like to extend it to other languages, but there we might end up running into these complications. Now, I don't speak Turkish, so I can't speak to what other features of the sentences might be informative about which entity you refer to, but there we kind of have to rely on trusting the language models to get better at deriving the structure. So I can't speak for Turkish, but in German, for example, I think there are good language models out there that would be able to resolve this. But in German, we also have gendered pronouns, so it's a bit of an open question at the moment.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right. Sorry, I'm not sure of your name, the gentleman with his hand up with the jacket. I don't know if that's name in the box. Did you have another question?
Oh, no, I forgot to take it down, actually. I'm Dr. J.P. Lindenmeyer from New York.
Okay. Pleased to make your acquaintance, Dr. Lindenmeyer. So Amir.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent presentation. I was personally excited to see your paper and attend to this presentation because I had a sort of similar interest. And in terms of the naming, I want to make a comment that we also thought that the work that we were trying to do could be named as semantic graph approach, because if you consider the context that this work is being done, it's actually developing on the context of works by Dr. Mota, who if you want to make a distinction, you would call that approach a structural approach and this approach semantic approach. So I think it's a plausible naming, and I wanted to make this comment. The question that I might want to ask is that we try to approach the same problem from different angle, both through the works that I did here with Sunny, and I previously did with my previous mentor, Dr. Nagavi, who is, I think, in the audience, a psychiatrist from Iran. The way that we tried to formulate the problem was to be able to dissect different levels of semantic information. What I saw in your way of modeling is that different ways of providing some semantic information, for example, about location, about manner of things being done, about the action relation between entities, are all like sort of merged together as relation between entities. Do you think if like we try to sort of isolate different categories of meaning or categories of information, would it be helpful? And just to wrap up, I'm gonna put the paper that Sunny mentioned, and there we try to like include only 2 levels of semantic information, being like action relations and predication relations as 2 like core main levels of semantic information. I'm gonna put it in the chat.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. And it's unfortunate that our visualization of the network doesn't really capture the amount of information that is actually written into these networks. Because exactly, I also thought that probably separating out the fact that something is an adjective and was just used as that, something else is actually being expressed as a relation between 2 nouns. So man is wearing a jacket. I wanted to make sure that people are able to actually separate those out, because I think being able to do that will be relevant, just because you might want to, this goes to kind of transdiagnostic mapping, but in other types of mental health conditions, you might want to actually just examine the adjectives with which, for example, node I is being described. So if you want to look at something like kind of negative thoughts about oneself, maybe you just want to look at the adjective edges and kind of analyze the valence of those. So in order to be able to do that with these networks, we encoded that as a property of the edge. So again, this wasn't shown here, but I'll show it later in the demonstration. You're able to extract this kind of rich information from the edges, which includes temporal information. So it includes the information of when in the transcript was this edge actually mentioned, when was this mentioned by the speaker. So maybe you can do something some kind of temporal analysis there as well. But also, what kind of edge is this? Is this an adjective edge that we derive just on the grammatical label, on the part of speech tags, or is this an edge that was extracted by the OpenIE information extraction tool, which is then these kinds of typical man and jacket kind of nodes. So that just is to say that this information, I think, is important to separate out. We didn't in this application, but you're able to do this with the tool.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm excited to see the features that you included in for the edges.
Thank you.
So we should also leave some time to actually look at the tool. Daria, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that's how I should pronounce it.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect.
Yeah,
very quick questions, just a clarification question about your network. Thank you, first of all. It's a great talk and it's a great results. About ambiguous pronouns, and most of the NLP techniques try to exclude those ambiguous pronouns. How did your network work? Did you exclude such cases and analyze it later? Or if you have found such cases, the program said, okay, I can go further, stop? Well, how does it work? I mean, and also repeated cases, because patients repeat and sometimes they use synonyms, you know, and how does your network works with such cases? Thank you so much.
That's a great question. So we try to keep the actual transcribed speech as close to the original as possible. So we didn't remove any kind of information that other NLP tools might remove. For example, for the LSA analysis, we really stayed as true to the speech as possible. So that also means repetitions will appear in the network, for example, as parallel edges. So if I said, I like the picture, and then later I go on to say, I really enjoy looking at the picture, these are 2 parallel edges that might express the same kind of concept, but the fact that it's repeated appears in the network. So we allow for these parallel edges. because we thought it is important to map it as, even though we have a fairly strict idea of what the networks is supposed to look like and what kind of relations we imagine in there, we wanted to keep all of them in there, because maybe there are features that we haven't thought about by constructing the network that will later come in and be important. So repetitions are in there, ambiguous pronouns. Now this goes back to the earlier questions. If the network, if NETS essentially doesn't find a co-reference between those two synonyms, then they will also appear as two separate nodes in the transcript. But something that is resolved by the co-referencing structure, that gets merged, because that is then that then definitely appears to reference the same entity.
Right. Thank you all. This has been a great discussion. We should, well, more to come though. Perhaps we should let Caroline and Ryan present their tool and perhaps illustrate some of the things we're discussing.
Yeah, thanks so much for the interesting discussion. I'll hand over to Ryan now to just demonstrate the setup and the running of NETS.
Share my screen. Cool. Okay, hi everyone. So yeah, my name is Ryan and I'm a machine learning engineer for the Accelerate Science program here at the University of Cambridge. So our main goal really is to facilitate the use of machine learning in research across a wide range of subjects. And an important part of that is to ensure that, you know, all the software that's developed in the course of research is developed with best practices in mind, and also to be as user-friendly as possible, so that the barrier to entry to actually start using some of these tools is as low as possible. So we do run a number of programs to teach core data science skills here at Cambridge to researchers, but we also have a clinic where people can contact us about any sort of software related issues that they're having. So if you are a researcher at the University of Cambridge and you are having some issues, then yeah, please do get in touch with us. So in developing NETS, the authors wanted it to be pretty easy to use, right? And Caroline and the Alan Turing Institute really did a great job of packaging everything together, because the language models used, trying to package them up in this modular way and make it user-friendly has some considerable challenges to it. So, I mean, I'm just going to quickly walk through how easy it is to sort of get from 0 to having a full-blown graph. So I'm using Mac OS, but you know, this is pretty much the same procedure in Linux or in Windows. If you've ever used Python before, you know, you'll know it's pretty easy to install third-party packages using pip, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. The good thing about using pip and NETS is that NETS will collect up all of the other packages that it depends on. So you won't have to worry about, you know, have I got the right version? Oh, I've got to download 10 other libraries and install them. NETS will just do all that for you. However, there are some packages that we had to build purpose-built commands in NETS to install, and those are the language models themselves. So there's just a small command, NETS install, and again, NETS will first of all search your hard drive, make sure you don't already have them installed, and then it'll collect them, download them, and install everything for you. So you're just seeing these warnings because I figured that you wouldn't want to watch me download, you know, 6 GB language models. So you don't have to do this in the command line. This is also possible to do in a Jupyter notebook or a Google Colab notebook as well, by just running the Python interface here, and that'll do the exact same thing as the command line. So now we're pretty much ready to start running transcripts. So in the bottom left, there's this directory, and I have a transcript here that's ready to go. So there's three main parts. So there's the command nets run. There's the path to the transcript, which is the second part. And then there's the output. So, where do you want this to go? So we're just going to send it to output single. And then now it's going to start running all this. So the language models themselves are very, very informative, right? They give a lot of information and they print it all out to the screen, and it can be quite overwhelming to see everything going on. So we sort of thought to aid the usability of the package that we would dump all this into a log file, that if you are more interested in seeing what's going on while all this is running, then you can check out that log file. So again, this can also be run with the Python interface, doesn't have to be on the command line, and running this cell here will give you a network X graph directly in your Jupyter notebook, or your Python script or Colab notebook, which you can then play around with in Jupyter. So running in the command line, we're really going to produce two things. So we're going to get a pickled network X graph object, which you can then subsequently load into Python. And it's also going to produce an image of the graph itself as well, so that you can just check to make sure everything's worked and get your sort of first graph. So here's the pickle graph object. Doesn't look like anything, but here is the actual graph itself, ready to go. So Network X will also run multiple transcripts at the same time. So I have here at the bottom in my transcripts folder an input folder with a further 5 transcripts. And Nets is clever. It will detect that you're trying to feed it a folder, and it'll just process everything in that folder. So it'll run through every single transcript in the folder, produce a pickled network X graph object and an image as well. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. In the space of sort of like 5 to 10 minutes, we've gone from no nets installed on our system to installing nets, and now we can produce multiple graph objects with transcripts. So yeah, again, if anybody is at Cambridge and has some interesting problems with their machine learning projects, then please do get in touch with us, and we'll see what we can do. That's about it. I'll hand you back to Karen.
Great. I think I might move on very quickly just to be able to show, I think we're running a little bit out of time, but we can take questions afterwards briefly. So I just wanted to very briefly demonstrate everything that I've promised you earlier in terms of the features that we actually encode. So let me just show you this very briefly. If you want to ever look at these tutorials, go back to them. So we have written extensive documentation, but we've also now got 2 tutorials up. One about what Ryan just presented, which is installing nets, setting it up, running one network, running several networks. So that is all as an interactive notebook, exists in a folder that I've shared with you. And also as blog posts, just walking you through the process. Now, I'm just going to pick up right where Ryan left off. So you've created one network and you've created a whole folder of networks. Now, what do you actually do with these? So what you first always do is you load the networks, a single network into your Jupyter notebook. Then the first thing that I always do is plot it, just to see, did the relations that I find in the transcript, did they actually make it into the network? So this is our network that we've plotted here. We've looked at this extensively, so you can see the nodes I, man, and jacket, and they're connected in the ways that we expect. Now, as for the actual features of this object, so one thing is we've stored the actual transcript inside the network object, just to be able to go back to that if you've lost track of where this network actually came from. Then the graph object here, part of your network, stores all the information about the nodes and edges. Now that already tells us what are the entities extracted and where are the relations. So for example, we know the node man and jacket is related to each other because that appears in this edge list that we get through this property. Okay, so when we now want to look into this edges a bit more closely, and this is where those features come in, we can, for example, examine the first edge. So we extract the edges this time by setting the data property to true, means we want all the data that we have about this edge. And then we describe that edge. So for example, for the first edge here, which is between man and jacket, we see that the relation is wearing. We see that the extractor, so the way that this was extracted was by Ollie or OpenIE5. So that is, Ollie was formerly the name of this particular toolbox. It's now called OpenIE5. So we know that this was extracted by the information extraction. And we also get a confidence measure. So we get a measure of how confident that model is that there is, in fact, an edge between these two. Then apart from the label, we also get the sentence information. Now, one thing you have to notice, Python starts counting at 0. So this is actually a 1. This is the first sentence that this transcript read. That is where this edge is coming from. So this is the kind of complex information, the information stored for the individual edges. Now, if you just want to look at the kind of common network measures, for example, degree, you can here get a list of the degrees of all the nodes in your network. You can also get this separated by in degree and out degree, meaning because we have a directed network, where the edges are directed, you can have an edge either going into the node or out of the node. And this is captured by the in degree and the out degree, just counting the amount of edges that are going out from the node and into the node. We can also examine just a single node that we might be interested in. So for example, man is a very central node. So we want to look at what that node degree is. It has 6 edges, and of those, 1 edge is going out, going in, and 5 are going out. We can save it just by running a little save function. And now actually to get to the heart of our analysis module, we've written a module that lets you perform these analyses fairly quickly and fairly automatic. So that means you get several basic descriptors directly for free by just running the analyze module with the calculate basic descriptors function. And that will return the number of words in your transcript. So there's just transcript measures, number of sentences, the number of nodes then in your network, number of edges, and here is the unconnected nodes. So those are those nodes that I mentioned that are just appearing when you say mountain, pencil, graph, anything like that. Those will all go into unconnected nodes. They won't appear in the edges, of course, because there was no edge expressed between that node and another node, but they all go into unconnected nodes. So you have that information in there. Then here we've calculated, we provide a function that just calculates these recurrence measures, meaning self loops, so cycles of node 1, cycles with two nodes, and cycles with 3 nodes. Since also Natalia Motta's work showed really nicely how these can be informative. And here we can also print the parallel edges. So for example, eye and picture, those are the 2 nodes that have 2 parallel edges, meaning they go between the same nodes and they go in the same direction from eye to picture. And we can print those out for our network. Now, this just shows you how to calculate actually the connected components, the ones that we found were informative. And so here, what I like to do a little bit is first just plot the network again, but this time in a schematic format where I can really see the connected components and I'm not distracted by actually the labels that are going on. And for our network, we can see that we've got 2 components, one big one of 12 nodes and one small one of just 2 nodes here. Okay, so leaving the connected components, we have provided a function that we use to calculate advanced properties. So that includes all of our previous properties, so words, sentences, all of that, recurrence measures, our connected components measures, but also these degree centrality measures. So for example, for our network here, we can look at the degree centrality measures. We can, for example, see that the node with the most edges is man. So the most edges are touching the node man, and that is maximum a degree centrality measure of 0.4. So let me just end very quickly on analyzing several networks. So now Ryan has previously shown you how to run a whole folder. What you can do with nets is just import that entire folder into your analysis module and then plot all of them at once. So here we can see again our original, the first one that we started with the big component and the little small component. Now we see the schematic visualization of all the other networks. And what we can see here is, for example, these other networks have these self loops, so these little circles right here. So that's a good way to just get a feel for your data set. I wouldn't recommend examining all 3,000 if you have a data set like this, but just for several networks, just to get an idea of what these look like and the structure of those. And then you can collect all the graph properties, giving you immediate access to a data frame that lets you analyze these different features. And now just to show you, we've actually just provided a means of plotting some of these features, ending on the image that I showed you earlier with our 3,000 networks. We can just examine the distribution of those features that we extracted. So I hope this was a little quick, so I thought we had a little more time, but we had a great discussion. So I'm not mad that we can't go through this one by one. But I hope this gave you a bit of a flavor of what you really can do with nets, and kind of the features that are really stored and might be interesting for your research and other applications. So thank you so much for your interest. This was a brilliant discussion, and I'm happy to take any more questions if there are any in the audience.
Thank you so much. This is a really fantastic tool, and I'm really grateful that you're sharing it with all of us. So Amir, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. It's excellent. I mean, and indeed, thank you for sharing this fantastic tool with us. I have just two practical questions, since I'm imagining we want to adopt your method in our practice. First, while Ryan was running the code, I saw a note which implied that the script is connecting to core NLP server. Is it any HIPAA issue involved here? I mean, is the data being sent to the core NLP server, or the analysis is being done locally? Because it's important if we want to run our data with your tool. And the second one is there any word limitation for the input of the module?
So the tool, I can answer the first question. The tool is being run locally. So there's no, aside from when you download the tool, the language models themselves, that's the only time you'll connect to a server. But other than that, it's all run locally. Yeah.
Great.
As for the second question, so there is not a stringent limitation on the length of the transcripts. So you are able to submit longer transcripts. The thing is, though, the tool will time out at a particular length. So we are running into the limitations of the tool actually being able to parse such a long transcript. We haven't had that issue because our transcripts are really limited to 1 minute of audio recording, but it can happen. So I just want to caution against that. It might be an idea to then separate the transcript, or try to lose some of the irrelevant, if there's a timestamp or something that you can lose from the transcript, that might be helpful. Although, yeah, at the moment, we're just reaching the ceiling there of the NLP capabilities.
Okay, great. Just to make sure we have time to hear from him, I think Lena has an announcement, and then we'll go back to the questions to answer as many as we can. Lena, do you want to jump in?
Well, my announcement could wait, but anyway, I will make it because you called me. Just wanted to remind everyone about the supplement being online, and primarily, it took us a year for working together on all this contribution. So thank you everyone who is here in the crowd for contributing to it. And the reminder is just to cite as much as you can the supplement. It's okay if you disagree with it, but just cite that you disagree with some of the papers. It will really help with spreading the word about our efforts in the consortium. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lena. I just wanted to make sure you got in before 10:30 since we're edging up so close. Yan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk and the demo. I saw the feature list, super helpful. So I'm wondering, do you have any suggestions about including the animacy feature of the nouns? For example, man, animate, jacket, inanimate, is it possible to do that? And also, what does negated mean? I saw the tag is false. And also, would you mind sharing like how accurate is the passive tag is? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think animacy was one of the things like valence that would be really interesting to incorporate. Now, at the moment, Nets doesn't include this analysis, so there are other tools out there where you would be able to incorporate this information. But what you can do is extract the nodes that you're interested in from Nets and then submit them to those tools, so you can merge those two worlds. As for the tags about negated, so negated means whether or not you were saying the man is wearing a jacket or the man is not wearing a jacket. So that's the negated tool. As for the passive qualifier, I haven't looked at it excessively. It depends on how accurate Ollie is. They are, as far as I know, the best out there at the moment that do this kind of information extraction. But I haven't tested myself how accurate the passive or active voice is here.
Great, thank you. And to Che.
Yes, hi again. In fact, after Dr. Hinzen's questions, my mind is a little bit confused, because when I see the speech networks, firstly, it's just maybe I can say that much more related with syntax, maybe more than semantics. For sure, they are related with each other, but that is why my mind is confused. For instance, there are many outputs of nets. How can we, sometimes we are finding significant results, but we cannot explain it because of limited literature. How can we relate, okay, these aspects of nets is related to these aspects of semantics, for instance, specifically? Can nets explain these in detail? I'm wondering these kind of things.
I think that's a good question, and it kind of goes on links to those points that we've touched on earlier. So I think I would refrain from saying nets can at this point explain anything. We really want to provide a perspective on things that we already know and that we're trying to dissect in schizophrenia and other mental health conditions. So I would say at the moment, nets can't explain and really provide a generative mechanism for any of these features. We could formulate ideas on the basis of what we see here, but I think at the moment we're a little bit, there's still work to be done to really then link it as to why does this happen. Now the semantics aspect really comes in my mind, in the way that we frame the network in the first place. So we want to provide a network that really expresses relations between things that the speaker has expressed a relation between. So that is where the semantics aspect comes in. The way that nets derives these networks, that is really reliant on syntactical grammatical structure. So I just want to be clear that even though the mechanism through which we arrive at these networks is further away from semantics as we might like it to be, I think it's hard to actually separate syntax and semantics in speech, right? Because that is just how speech is structured. We impart a semantic relation onto something by expressing a grammatical structure in our sentences. But the fact that the semantic speech networks actually are supposed to map these relations in a semantically meaningful way, so in a way that we also think, I would argue, think of the world as these information units, these units in the world, and we express a relation between them, I think that is where the semantics aspect really comes in. And our analysis at the moment doesn't look at this as much as it could by incorporating those aspects of the node labels, what those actually are, the maximum degree labels, for example, or the context in which these nodes are described.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Caroline.
Perhaps we can also think of explanation on multiple levels. It sounds like Tiche was talking about explanation in terms of like linguistic elements that are being reflected in terms of the different features, whereas I think Peter brought up kind of explainability in terms of underlying constructs and clinical phenomena. So for the first one, perhaps might be a somewhat simpler, though still difficult problem to solve. I wonder if simulations and like artificially manipulating speech and then looking at the output could be informative in the future.
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really interesting point. And my work at the moment is trying to get at something like this. So using actual generative models, I mean, we've seen with ChatGPT just where the field is going towards, where you can really manipulate the inputs of those language models and derive something where you can then see, so what does this speech actually look like if I manipulate this particular mechanism? So this is something that my current work is also incorporating.
Thank you. And perhaps one last question, Wei Wei.
Thanks. Hello, Carol. I'm working with Lena, and we to do some semantic network work with the schizophrenia patients, and we found that the median size of connected components is most powerful index to differentiate schizophrenia patients and the health controls. I want to ask to practice more practical questions is that we carefully look into the semantic network, and we found some entities. We found some entities as quite confused with some entities, like sentences, I do not know what else to say about that. And I is one entity that's very clear. But another entity is what else to say about that. And the H connected them is do not know. And so is the entity that what else to say about that is entity is okay, or that's something we need to modify or to work further. And another question is about the median size of the connected component itself, because let's say we have one script, we got two components, and one component is like 10 nodes, and another component is 2 nodes. So the median size is 6, right? If we had another transcript, we got 3. We got 3 components, and like 10 to 1, and the median size of connected component will be 2. So the two, let's say the two transcripts have similar, they are similar, but it's just about the component number affects the median size of connected components. I think it's too much. Do you think this will bias the results that's like between group comparison, or you think that's okay?
So I apologize. I don't know if I got everything correctly, but I'll try to start from the top. So one is these kind of complex sentences, or what I would argue is going away from these noun, verb, object, kind of very simply constructed sentences. I have noticed that Nets is reaching its limitations there in order, like in actually extracting relations when you have something that is what I would argue a fairly complex way of phrasing these relations. And I think, so I've looked into this a little bit, I think it's because OpenIE 5, really the example that they always bring is Barack Obama is president of the United States, where you clearly can see the two nodes and the relation between the two. So that is the kind of use that this was generated for. And I think complexities beyond that, we're again relying on language models that are not perfect yet. Maybe if we plug in something that was more recently developed, that will actually increase performance. So I completely take your point there. The second question on the median connected component size, I'm not quite sure if I understood exactly what your question was there. Could you maybe repeat that part?
Yes, it's because the number of components of the network is limited because we have only 1 minute talk. So we found that some patients, some subjects only have like one component or 2 components. So the median size of the connected component will somewhat large, let's say.
So
yeah.
Yes, okay. So I think there it's important to actually normalize to size matched random networks. So this is why we went through all those hoops of like generating 1,000 random networks that are matched for the size of that network, and then calculate on those and then normalize our real measure onto those. I don't think this is a perfect normalization. It doesn't take out all of the effect of poverty of speech. But I think it's a first step to making sure that you take out those differences. I think it's very tricky when it comes to transcripts, or maybe there's only one relation in there. I think then again we're reaching a kind of flooring effect. But we found that to be effective in normalizing our network measures. So we made sure to only look at or mostly look at those normalized measures.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So Caroline, I think that your fears of ending the talk too early, the seminar too early, did not come true. It's fair to say. This is I love that speaking with this group every time. Everyone has always such rich ideas and things to discuss. But thank you again. This is fantastic, and hope to see many of you when we have our next seminar on April 14th.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.